Yeah, but I want to get it right. I want to get it right. You guys had another grandkid. Mazel tov. Mazel tov, mazel tov. Anybody else have good simchas to share? They had a grandchild. What? Rachel's wedding. That was a nice wedding, Taka. Mazel tov. Really? You don't look at that. That's wonderful. Okay. Pesach, Sukkot. Wait. No, it's the other way around. Okay. Keep talking. I have to find a page. I'll be right there. Pesach. Pesach, Shavuos, Tisha B'Av. Almost there. Fast days. No, that's. Where is. Second day, Shabbos Shuvah. Here it is. Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. Happy summertime. I hope you're having a lovely summer. Oops, there we go. It's nice to be back. I'm Rabbi Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom. You're in the right place. Okay? Anyone looking for the bereavement group, that's up the hallway. We're going to be talking about some books tonight, okay? A couple of announcements before we get started. It's really nice to see everyone, and welcome back, and we're delighted you're here. And those of you who are part of the shul, welcome back. And those of you who are visiting, we're delighted you're here, and you're welcome to hang out with us even more. This Shabbat, that's Saturday morning, in addition to a bar mitzvah, two ufrufs, and a new baby, we're going to be welcoming Congressman Brad Sherman. This is the opening of a series of 6 programs that we're going to be putting on in political education to help us become more informed and reflective citizens, help us vote in a better way, and help us live as Americans in a better way. So this Shabbat, this Saturday morning, Congressman Sherman, who is he's one of the members of the House International Relations Committee, and he's the chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism for the House International Relations Committee. And he's the author of, whenever you hear about sanctions on Iran or sanctions on Syria, he wrote them because he knows more about banking law than anybody on the planet. Anyone should know. Anyway, he's coming on Shabbos morning, and he's the last few minutes of the service, the last 20 minutes or so of the service, he's going to spend talking about his vision of where America is in the world today. And then after lunch, and we'll have a chance to schmooze with him, have a conversation with him about his vision of America and the world. And then in September, on September the 17th, our guest will be Congressman Adam Schiff, who will talk to us about the second half of that conversation about America and the world. And Representative Schiff, he's the congressman from Glendale. So I think it's everything from North Hollywood East. Burbank, Glendale, that area. He's the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, which means he supervises the CIA. So he knows all the secrets. And he has a sense of the world that very few of us get. So he's going to be talking to us about similar things. And you'll find in the synagogue literature, there's a flyer with all this on it, with all the dates, a series of programs about domestic and foreign policy and the issues that affect California, Los Angeles, and the nation. And everyone is invited to come and to share those. But it starts out this Shabbos with Congressman Sherman. Then, got this so far? Good? Aaron, good? Next Thursday night, a week from tonight, which is September the 1st, if you can believe it. Next Thursday night, we're going to meet again. I think it's at 7 o'clock. And that's going to be the opening of a conversation that we're going to be having for a month. This year, the Jewish calendar is a little quirky. Well, it's always a little quirky, but this year it's especially quirky because there's an entire month between Labor Day and the high holidays. That month in the Hebrew calendar is called Elul. And the month of Elul is devoted to introspection and reflection. What kind of person have I been, and how do I get ready for the holidays? So the question that's at the heart of Elul is the first question asked in the Bible. Anybody happen to know what the first question asked in the Bible is? Ayeka. Ayeka. Adam and Eve are hiding in the garden, and God comes looking for them. It's the world's first game of hide-and-go-seek. And God says, Ayeka, which means, where are you? And that's such a profound question, because in some ways that's the question that the whole rest of the Bible comes to answer. Where are you? What are you doing in your life? How far have you come, and where are you going? So we're going to spend a month thinking about Ayeka. You're going to be getting, those of you who have computers, cell phones, iPads, and you're connected to Valley Beth Shalom, you're going to get a daily message from us. One of the rabbis or the educators is going to appear on your telephone speaking for about 2 minutes about one aspect of Ayeka, one aspect of reflecting on this new year. You're going to hear us talk about this in the Torah study on Shabbos morning, which begins the first Shabbat in September. And at all the various meetings and gatherings and services that we'll have, we're going to be talking about this idea. The Hebrew word is, it's hard to say, it's Ayeka. Can you say that? I think, when we were trying to, Alana's here, we were trying to figure out a logo for this. So I had this idea of a tall bush, and we would say Ayeka, right? And somebody said there should be a German Jew, which is Ayeka. And somebody else said a big fuzzy animal from Tibet, which is a yaka. So it turns out ayeka. That's the way you say it. Yes. Ayaka. That's a good one too. Ayaka. Right? So these are it's the Hebrew word for where are you. And the last thing I'll say is that if you look at the art exhibition, which just went up, it just went up literally yesterday. This is an art exhibition inspired by that question. These are contemporary artists, many of them are Israeli artists, who were inspired by that question to create reflections about where we are in our lives. And there's a particular installation up the hallway where you're going to get a chance to take a little form and write your own answer to the question and put it into the form and become part of the art exhibition. This is participatory art. And we're going to talk about that stuff, and it's all going to be presented next week on Thursday night, which is September the 1st at 7 o'clock. So please come back next week. The cantor is going to be here and do a little new music with us. We're going to present the art piece, and then I'm going to teach about this idea of Ayeka and how it fits into the whole philosophy of the high holidays. So that's a little bit of things going on. Torah study begins the first Shabbat in September, so not this week, but in 2 weeks. Okay, and Lunch and Learn, for those of you who like to come on Wednesdays, is on the 21st. That's the first Lunch and Learn. Okay, and all of the rest of the programs of the synagogue you can read about in the various brochures that are outside. Any questions? Did I leave anything out, Mel? I get what? I don't know. Because I need some time to write a high holiday sermon. You know, so if I'm sitting with you, I'm not home right. My wife is having the house painted. And she needs me around, you know? Why does she need me around? I have no idea, but when I'm there, she says she feels much better. So we're having the house painted. Would everyone please stand, turn to the folks beside you and say good evening and welcome. And welcome. Nice to have you all here tonight. Nice to see you, Bob. How's your wife? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. All right. Yeah, all right, send my love, yeah? All right, before you sit down, now that don't sit down, put your arms around the people next to you, gather them close. Whenever we have a chance to learn, it's a great joy. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. 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 Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. This series this summer has dealt with the books that we rabbis have been reading, and I know you studied David Brooks's book with Rabbi Hoffman. You studied Atul Gawande's book with Rabbi Farkas. You studied Jonathan Sachs' book with Rabbi Taff. And tonight, I'm going to recommend this book to you, which is by my teacher and friend, Rabbi Daniel Hartman, and it's called Putting God Second. Right away, the title is a sort of arresting title. Because when a rabbi writes a book, you'd expect him to put God first. And that's what you'd expect the book about. But he is intentionally challenging you by calling the book Putting God Second. And this is a very, very deep and remarkable statement of the inner life of a religious leader. Hartman's fundamental question is the following. Why is it that the world is filled with so much violence done in the name of religion? If religion's purpose is to make us better people, if religion's purpose is to rouse us from our egotistical kinds of self-centered self-absorption and teach us to care about the other and teach us to be responsive to the needs of the other and to be responsible citizens of the world, how do you explain the fact that so much violence in the world is done in the name of religion? In the name of religion. Now, there are two typical answers to that question. One which comes from the critics of religion, and one which comes from the adherents of religion, and both of which Rabbi Hartman's going to reject. The critics of religion will say that religion by its very nature is an immoral proposition. Because what religion does, the critics will say, is offer an authority that's higher than conscience. So people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Brown and the late Christopher Hitchens will write very strong criticisms of religion and say religion is a bad thing. It divides people instead of uniting people. It sets people against each other. It defines certain people as believers and other as heathens, as outsiders and insiders. Religion is a bad thing. And the world would be better without religion, says Hitchens and others. And those who are adherents of religion, those who are on the inside of religion, will look at it in a different way. They'll say religion is pure. It's just that when people get hold of it, they screw it up. It's not that religion is evil. It's that the uses people put religion to are evil. And it's a reflection of innate human evil, not the religion itself. Now, either one of these arguments, both of these arguments have elements of truth in them. The critic of religion, you'll see in a moment, has something true when he says that there's a problem in religion which might lead people to do certain evil kinds of things. And the religious person has something to say when he says that people have innate qualities which sometimes are made worse by religion. Rabbi Hartman wants to go a third way, and he wants to argue that it's not simply that religion itself is bad, because religion can also be very good. It can inspire altruistic behavior, kind behavior. It can teach us to be generous and charitable and kind. And he'll also see that he rejects the insider's view that it's just evil people, because there's just too much violence in the world in the name of religion, and religion seems to excuse too much violence to make that argument. He's going to make a third argument, which in many ways is much more radical than the other two. He's going to say religion has an autoimmune disease. There is something built into the structure of religion, and particularly he's going to talk about monotheism, and he's going to use Judaism as his case study. He's going to say that there is something built into the very structure of monotheism which leads to bad behavior. And that's something that we religious people have to take with some seriousness. And it's always been there, But it's been there's been a struggle within religion to control it. And he's going to use Judaism as his case study, and at the end of the book he sort of argues that it would be wonderful to read a similar book by a Muslim scholar and a similar book by a Christian scholar and by other kinds of scholars. But he's going to use Judaism as his case study. So let's step back for a minute and ask the question, has Judaism contributed to immoral behavior? Well, you don't have Jewish people flying planes into into buildings. That's good. But on the other hand, Yigal Amir, the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, was a very religious person who got his ideas from his rabbis. He made this confession, that it was his rabbis who gave him the vision that Rabin was evil, and gave him the idea that it was his responsibility to kill him. And one of the reasons why Yigal Amir's case in Israel is so difficult, not just that a Jew killed a Jew, or a Jewish zealot killed the prime minister of the state of Israel, he's never shown any remorse for it. He's never expressed any remorse for what he did. He really believes he saved the state of Israel. So the idea that a person could attend yeshiva, be a very devout Jew, and perform an act which we all agree is egregiously evil on many levels, not just that it's murder, but that it's political murder, and it's vicious political murder. You got to stop and ask the question, well, what did we do to create that kind of a personality? How did we create that kind of personality? So here Hartman's going to say that the fundamental commitment of Judaism has always been that you are not to stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. That the purpose of the faith is to try to create moral people. But there are two flaws within our religion, within all monotheistic religions, which lead to bad behavior. And he calls these God intoxication and God manipulation. Let's take each one of these one at a time. What is God intoxication? God intoxication is a condition in which a person stands before the Lord, before God, and is so taken with the presence of God that that presence of God eclipses all other commitments, all other concerns. And that person performs an act which, under normal circumstances, any one of us would say is an evil act, but that person doesn't in the name of religion, and therefore it's excused. What's the most famous case of God intoxication? God comes to Abraham in the 22nd chapter of Genesis and says, "Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and offer him up on one of the mountains that I'm going to show you." And what does Abraham do? He does it. He takes his kid, sneaks out of the house so his wife won't stop him, crosses the desert for 3 days, climbs up Mount Moriah, binds up the child on the altar in front, raises the knife over the kid, and only then does the angel show up and say, "Stop, this isn't what I really wanted." And then even then, there's a question about what he does next. Now, how do you understand that kind of a story? How do you understand that? Now, the next line is that God says or the angel says to Abraham, "Because you were willing to do this, I will make my covenant with you forever." This becomes the shining moment of faith. But you got to step back and say, what kind of father raises a knife over his child? And not just what kind of father raises his knife over. The guy waited his whole life to have a kid. He was 100 years old when the kid was born. And this is slightly before Viagra was invented. And his wife was 90. Nebuch, And this is not just a kid, this is a miracle kid. And you waited. And then you snuck out of the house and you take the kid and you bind him up and you raise a knife over him. So the great Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, who lives at the end of the 19th century, tells a story about a sleepy Lutheran churchgoer in Copenhagen who falls asleep in church. Can happen, while the minister is talking, and he wakes up in the middle of the sermon, and the sermon is this minister extolling the faith of Abraham. What a great man is Abraham to take his son to the top of the hill and offer him to God. And this sleepy churchgoer gets it in his head that he will do Abraham's act. He'll do it too. After all, if it was good for Abraham, and he's the father of us all, it must be good for all of us. So after church, he goes home and he takes his son and he goes to the top of the nearest hill outside of Copenhagen, and he's about to plunge a knife into the kid's chest when the police arrive and they arrest him for child endangerment. And Kierkegaard asks a very good question. What's the difference between Abraham and any garden variety child abuser? It's a pretty brutal question when you think about it. Why isn't Abraham a criminal? Why isn't Abraham evil? And the answer is because he did it at God's behest. So Kierkegaard offers a phrase which becomes immortal in the annals of philosophy, and I'll teach it to you, and you can drop it into conversation tomorrow night at your Shabbos table, and everyone will think that you're brilliant. The teleological suspension of the ethical. Thank you very much. Good night. The teleological suspension of the ethical. All right, let's get each word, right? Teleological means a process whereby you go from here to here. So what's happening? Abraham is becoming a man of faith. And how do you become a man of faith, says Kierkegaard? It's the teleological suspension of the ethical. The suspension of the ethical means sometimes, as an act of faith, I have to violate my own conscience. That is, conscience, morality is on one level, and faith is on a higher level. And in order to show my loyalty and devotion to God, I sacrifice my own morality. Which means that in Kierkegaard's Midrash, Abraham knows damn well that what he's doing is dead wrong. Murdering your child is wrong. But he's going to do it anyway because God told him to do it. And that's the highest level of faith, says Kierkegaard. And that's the highest level of faith. Now, it's really, and he says, you can't understand this in any other way. Because otherwise, if you don't accept this notion of a teleological suspension of the ethical, of the ethical being suspended for a higher purpose, then Abraham becomes a garden variety child murderer. Right? So Kierkegaard praises him as this wonderful knight of faith. Hartman, among others, many, many others have written commentaries on this book, right? And by the way, the book by Kierkegaard is a cheery book. It's called Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard was a very happy fellow. His most famous book is called Dread Unto Death, right? Sickness unto death and dread. He was a dark-souled Dane, right? It's a terrible thing. But so Fear and Trembling, Sickness unto Death, Dread. These are happy books, right? Now, what does Hartman say? Hartman says that is problematic. Because the person who will say, out of loyalty to my God, I will suspend my morality, he calls that God intoxication. And what happens in that circumstance is that you end up with a split thinking. That is, God's presence in the life of the believer is so powerful that you split the thinking between faith and morality. And you pose it as an either-or. Either you're faithful to the God who commands you, or you're faithful to the morality that you know is right, but it has to be an either-or. And he presents from the Talmud a very interesting case. There's a case in the Talmud that asks the following question. You know that in the book of Numbers, in the book of Leviticus, we're commanded that certain kinds of clothing we can't wear, cloth. You can't mix wool and linen, called kilayim. It's shatnez. Anybody ever know what I'm talking about? So the question is, what happens if you're walking in the street and you discover that quite by accident, the outfit you're wearing is shatnez. It contains a mixture, a forbidden mixture of fibers. Says the Talmud, take it off, even if you're standing in the middle of the street. Okay, then it asks the next question. What happens if you see your neighbor? And your neighbor is wearing an outfit, and you know that's kilayim, you know that's shatnez, you know that violates the Torah's law of mixing fibers. Says the Talmud, strip it off of him. And then they have a third one. A woman is walking in the marketplace, and she has a headdress on, a big hat. And the hat has something on it which is forbidden. Idolatrous, strange, I don't know. It's a forbidden hat. A burkini, how's that, right? If you're in France, this is what's going on, right? Talmud says, knock it off her head. Now, Hartman asks us to take a minute and think about that idea. Think of the shame and humiliation of that woman. Think of the shame and humiliation of your neighbor. I mean, it's one thing if you say, I discover that I'm wearing a forbidden shirt, I take it off myself. But to take off to strip my neighbor forcefully of their clothing because it violates my interpretation of Torah. And the idea here is, it doesn't matter. God said it. That, says Hartman, is a case of God intoxication, where what you know is right, the dignity of the other, the presence of the other, the prohibition against humiliating another in the public space, you violate because your Torah tells you to. Because your Torah tells you to. That's called God intoxication. Did the guys who drove the airplanes on 9/11, do you think they had moral qualms? Don't say no. There were 19 men. There were 20, but one guy got sick that morning, right? There were 19 guys flying those airplanes. You think that at any point they stopped and said, this is wrong, but it's what we must do anyway? Just give it some thought. It's an interesting question. There's an interesting document that was published many years ago. It's a speech. It's a speech given by Hermann Himmler at the dedication of the Auschwitz concentration camp. They had a ceremony dedicating the opening of Auschwitz, right? And he's speaking to the staff, to the crew that's going to run the Auschwitz concentration camp. And he says to them, you're going to feel sorry for these people. You're going to feel moral qualms about doing what you're about to do. But I want you to quell those qualms, to put away those hesitations, because this is for the fatherland. That's an interesting observation, because Himmler understands that natural human pity on human beings. And he says, I want you to stifle that urge to feel pity, because these people are enemies of the fatherland. These are Jews who have to be destroyed for the world to be pure. So this is a kind of intoxication that comes when you have an absolute belief in a divinity. In that case it's Hitler, in this case it's God, a divinity that tells that is in you, that is present to you. And this is the first problem that Hartman points to. The second problem that Hartman points to is something he calls God manipulation. And God manipulation is somewhat different, because in this case, what happens is you assert a chosenness. I'm chosen and you're not. And the notion of chosenness imposes a kind of barrier, a kind of binary thinking. Us, them. Our people, those people. Children of light, children of darkness. The blessed, the saved, and the damned. And what you're allowed to do then, in that kind of a binary structure, is to say, I care about our people, I care nothing about theirs. I'm only obligated to protect my own, I'm not obligated to protect theirs. Their plight, their fate, their being in the world is none of my business. It's not my problem, because they're not us. I'm only here for us. So in the same way that the first thing, God intoxication, splits faith from morality, God manipulation splits us from them. It divides humanity into two. There is a law in the Talmud. It's a very interesting law. If you find a lost object in the marketplace, there's a very careful, the Torah says you have to return it to its owner. So you walk into the marketplace and you find a sheep wandering around. Right? You're walking on Ventura Boulevard early in the morning, and a sheep comes walking down, and it's a sheep, and no one's around to claim this sheep. According to the Torah, what do you need to do? You need to take that sheep home with you, right? Set it up in a bedroom with a television set in a bed, and then make every reasonable effort in order to find the owner of said sheep. So you put notices on Facebook and you tack things up on phone poles. Found white sheep. Called, no questions asked, you know? And you tried to find the owner of the sheep. Now, according to that's the Torah's law. The Talmud goes into greater detail. What if the sheep gets sick? You got to call Lloyd, right? You got to call a sheep doctor. Are you supposed to pay for a sheep doctor for a sheep that you found which doesn't really belong to you? Because you just, yes! You have to do everything for that sheep that you would do for your sheep. Right? What if the sheep has babies? You have to feed them, care for them, send them to college? Yes. Says the Talmud, yes. Now, there's a very, very long chapter in the Talmud, in Bava Metzia, about rules of lost and found. And you can see how these are structured, because when I enter the public space, I have to be aware of the fact that I'm surrounded by others and I'm responsible for them. And I'm responsible for their stuff. And therefore, I have to help find the owner of the thing. I can't be egotistical and say, gee, I always wanted a sheep like that. Right? Somebody once parked a Tesla in my driveway. And I was very tempted to say, gee, I always wanted a Tesla. You know, finders keepers, losers weepers is not an ethic you can create a society based on. That's a very egotistical ethic. But there's one big exception in the Talmud. Can you guess what it is? Now we can talk here because the doors are closed. Can anybody guess what it is? That only applies to Jews. If you find the lost object of a non-Jew, you're not obligated to return it. This is Talmudic law. Now, why not? Why not? Anybody can think. Guess why not? Well, here's the logic of the Talmud. You ready? Here's what? Well, holy. It's a sheep, you know. If I find a sheep and I determine that this is a non-Jewish sheep, he's got a big cross around his neck, you know, right? He's not circumcised, right? Thank you. That's very good. That's very good. I like that. Right. I'm not if the non-Jew comes and says that's my sheep, you're not obligated to give it back. Now here's the logic. You ready? Here's the Talmud's logic. Okay? The Talmud's logic is when God gave the laws of civilization to the Jewish people, he offered those laws to all the other peoples of the world. All the other peoples of the world rejected those laws. We were the only people in the world who said, yes, we'll take God's laws. And therefore, because we were the only people in the world willing to live under God's legislation, right? We don't owe them anything. Our laws, the laws that protect the rights of Jews, don't apply to them. Now wait, it gets worse, as they say on television. But wait, what if a non-Jew finds the lost object of a Jew? Say what? He has to give it back. You see? So there's a real lack of reciprocity here. There's a dissymmetry in the law. The non-Jew has to give the Jew back his lost object, but a Jew doesn't have to give the non-Jew back his lost object. Now, why not? Because we're God's chosen people and they're not. That's the reason why. Because we're the chosen people and they're not. That's a species of God manipulation. And he calls it God manipulation because what happens is once you bring God into the picture, what we tend to do is to project ourselves onto God and then reappropriate that image. We're the chosen people, they're not. And what you do then is you project yourself, but not just your best sides. You project your evil onto God also. You make God a discriminating God. Right? There's a funny aspect to this, which is how many ball games have you watched, and after one side wins, they interview the player, and the player says, I just want to thank God for God, all glory to God. God helped us win this game. Oh, that's great. I can just see God in heaven saying, I'm for the Dodgers, let the Giants rot in hell. You know? But the idea that like God's on my side and not on their side, that is a manipulation of religion. These, one more line, and then I'll get your questions. Don't lose it. These two conditions, God intoxication and God manipulation, are endemic. They're built into monotheism. Because when you add God to the human picture, to the human repertoire of responses, you end up with a warped response. Says Hartman, how do you fix that? How has Jewish tradition attempted to fix that, and how can we fix it? So now we have the problem, now we'll get the solution. Yes, please.
How far does the chosenness extend? You don't have to return lost property.
Right.
But is it okay to murder someone who's not Jewish?
Well, that is a wonderful question. That is a wonderful, wonderful question. You asking me, or are you asking the Jewish tradition? If you ask me, you sort of can figure out what my answer is going to be. There is a group of rabbis. You're going to find this very obnoxious, so take a breath. Ready? There's a group of rabbis in Israel who are the patron rabbis for the extreme settler movement on the West Bank, who have offered rabbinic tshuvas, rabbinic opinions, that the expropriation, mean stealing, of land from Palestinians by Jews is not a sin. The expropriation of property by Jews of Palestinian property is not a sin. There was one rabbi, his name is Ginsburg, who said, the murder of a non-Jew who is occupying Jewish holy land and won't leave on his own volition, the murder of that non-Jew is acceptable. Now, that rabbi, you should know, does not represent the majority of Judaism, the majority of Israeli rabbis. He doesn't even represent the majority of West Bank settler rabbis, but he very publicly said this. And he justified it with a lot of this idea. That's the reason Hartman wrote the book. Because Hartman, who lives in Israel, is very concerned that when you take God manipulation, see, if you're in America and you take God manipulation, so you end up with Jewish chauvinism, which a lot of our Jews suffer from. But it's not going to hurt too much because you're in a pluralistic American society governed by American law. But if you take God manipulation and you add to it the power of a sovereign government, you end up with ISIS. Because what is ISIS's philosophy? It's the same as that rabbi's. If you are of another faith, I owe you nothing. I owe you no consideration as a human being. I owe you no respect for your property or your possessions. I owe you your dignity and your feelings, no respect whatsoever. You are my enemy by definition. That's ISIS, right? And you find the same phenomenon among very extreme elements in the Israeli political scene. And it's important for us to know this. It's important for us to know this. Yes, we have our own Mishigoyim also. That's the idea. But more than that, it's important to hear where it comes from within this religious tradition. Now, Hartman is now going to talk to us about how to solve this. I just want to get the rest of the questions. So, David.
You tell me if I'm taking you way off track.
Yeah, listen, it's summer evening.
It's okay.
Nothing on television but Donald Trump, so it's better to...
just something that it triggered in me, which is tangential to...
Yeah.
But that idea that you said where Abraham, for instance, is going to kill Isaac, and yet he surrenders to God, to God's will. That there is from my experience, is that there are times in my life, often, in order for me to grow as a person, that I have to depart from what I think is the way to live, to handle some particular situation, to handle my life in general. And so when you were talking about that, I hope I'm being clear, that it sort of paralleled that, and I wondered if part of the genesis, no pun intended, was of this issue, this kind of thing where you are surrendering to some other will that seems, on the face of it, not right to you, is also an opportunity possibly to look at something differently and grow from it.
Yes, but there's a difference between looking at something differently and growing. Look, let's put it this way. If the object of that behavior is your own self, that's one thing. If the object of that behavior is somebody else, and your conscience tells you this is wrong, the pattern of your morality tells you this is wrong, thank you so much, then one ought to be very careful, because that's very difficult, right? That's a very difficult thing. And I think that well, we'll talk about the solutions in a moment, but part of this is the question of deliberation. Is there an opportunity in this situation, in a moral situation, to stop and think about it, to reflect on it, to ask other people for their experiences? One of the interesting things about the Abraham story, the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac, is he doesn't stop and ask his wife. He doesn't stop and ask anybody. He runs off and does this by himself. And you wonder, would the Abraham story had been different had he stopped and asked a few people, you think I ought to do this? You know? So the Jewish tradition is relentlessly social for a reason, because in a social reflection, in a social deliberation, you end up with something called intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivity is the solution to being so stuck in your own head, right, or other parts of your anatomy, that you fail to see what's right in front of you. You ever been in a situation where you got so stuck into a situation and it took another person to say, look, right? Because you can get stuck in it. You know what I'm talking about? That's part of the deliberation that goes on, right? Yeah, Pop. Go ahead.
There's one other case that Hartman forgot.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example.
Okay.
If you keep my mitzvot, I will give you the rain in the season. But
Yeah.
if you violate, I will take away the rain.
Right.
Okay. I'm keeping the mitzvot. But these three people, they're doing something on Shabbos that could be detected as a violation of the Shabbos.
And that's why it's not raining.
No, wait a minute. And if it doesn't, yes, and if it doesn't rain, they'll be punished, but I'll be punished also.
There you go.
So my job is to convince them to go back and follow the mitzvot, and if not, I gotta follow out the laws of the Torah. They have to be stoned to death.
No. The first part, yes, you can go and persuade them to keep the laws of the Torah. The second, there's no law in the Torah that says you have to go stone them to death.
But I'll starve.
Right? So you'll starve, but at least you won't be a murderer. And we'll say nice things about you, you know? Right? You feel better? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. Hey, Jake or Nathan?
Noah.
Noah.
All right. But in looking at the Abraham story with the Akedah of Yitzhak, we have to take into account that the society at the time, child sacrifice was a common feature of the Canaanite religions, and in breaking from the secular traditions of the day, they were striking out on their own.
I'm going to argue that point with you, because I love you, and you should get it right, okay? Number one, child sacrifice was common only in urban societies that had become overpopulated, not in rural societies. Abraham was rural. He lived out in the countryside. In that circumstance, every child was a blessing, because you needed more kids to watch more sheep. Child sacrifice was only common when you had a walled city and the population of that city was growing and couldn't fit inside the walls. And so it became it was both a social solution and also an ideology, okay? At the time of Abraham, child sacrifice was not practiced. It wasn't practiced till much later when Jerusalem became a great metropolis. That's number one. Number two, if the story of the Akedah was about child sacrifice, then why doesn't it say so? Why doesn't God say at the end of the story, Abraham, don't kill your kid, and tell your children from now on, I don't want their children, I want sheep, or something. It doesn't say that. Never does that. If that story was about prohibiting child sacrifice, it should have said that, because that's the way biblical stories work. You have the experience, and then the lesson is given to you explicitly. Instead, it says, on the contrary, it says, because you were willing to sacrifice your kid, you're going to get all these goodies. What's behind door number 3? He rewards him for all of that stuff. I don't think that story is about child sacrifice. And here I think Hartman has this right. I think there was a debate that is recorded in the pages of the Bible and later in the pages of the Talmud about what it means to live with God. And one voice in that debate said, living with God means sacrificing everything to God, including your morality. In other words, the author of that story knows damn well that child murder is child murder, and it's just the most despicable thing one can think of. And yet, if God wants it, he's willing to do it because Abraham is willing to sacrifice everything, including his own conscience, to show his devotion to God. And that's a voice in the Bible. Yes, it's there. It's part of our tradition. And then there's another voice. And that voice has exactly the opposite point of view. When Abraham is told by the angels who come visit him that God is about to strike Sodom and Gomorrah, what does Abraham say? He says, you can't do that. What if there are 50 good people in the city? You can't destroy the whole city for the sake of the 50 good ones. You can't, because that's the line is very, we've talked about this a million times. The line is very, very vivid. It's the 27th line. It says, Chalila lecha me'asot davar kazeh. Shame on you, God. Feh! You should think about something like this, to do such a thing. Lahamit sadikim rasha. To kill off the good and the evil, the innocent and the guilty together. V'haya katzadi karasha. So that your world becomes a world which lacks moral differentiation. Chalila lecha hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Shame on you for even thinking this. The judge of all the earth has to do justice. Now that story is the opposite story. That story says that there is a standard of goodness in the world, a standard of morality in the world, that even God is subject to. And that when God violates that morality, it's man, it's human beings' obligation as the covenantal partner to point it out to him. And to say, you can't do that. And now what's wonderful about that story is the next line. After Abraham takes God down, what's the next line? The next line is, I'll tell you what the next line should have been. There's a little movie you have to, I told you this before, there's a little movie you have to go look up on the computer when you get home. It's called Bambi versus Godzilla. Has anyone ever seen this little movie? It's a 10-second movie. I'll give you the whole plot, right? It opens up, anyone remember Bambi? Sure. Right, so it opens up with the scene of the forest, and the birdies, and the butterflies, and the bunnies, and the raccoons, and here's little Bambi, frolicking around. And then out of the top of the screen, you see this enormous, gigantic foot. That's the whole movie. A man stands before God and says, you can't do this because it's immoral? God should have smushed him like a bug. What did God need this crap for? What do you think? Who tells God what to do? God should have smushed him like a bug. Wham! That's what should have happened. The next line of the Bible says, God says what? Okay. Jackie Mason once said the greatest Jew in the world was Menachem Begin, and his greatest line was, all right. Okay, fine, okay, all right. God says, okay. Why does God say okay? Because God recognizes in that story, because that story is about the other voice. That's what we're about to get to. The other voice says that there is a morality that binds us all, including God. And that when that you can't separate faith from morality, because faith and morality must lead to the same place. Okay? That's the other voice. And what you have in the Bible is a machloket. You have an argument, just like you have in the Talmud, between these two voices. Okay? That's what you got there. That's it. Shelley, hi.
That's a brilliant statement in the Bible. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Shouldn't the judge of all the world do justice?
Right.
If God were a Roman god or a Greek god, like you said, I do whatever I want. Justice doesn't matter.
Not only a Roman god and a Greek god, by the way, we can go farther and I can spend more time on this if you want. But there's a book of the Bible that establishes that personality for God. It's called Job. When Job says to God, why are you doing this? What does God say to Job? Shut up.
Yeah.
Because I can. Because I'm God. Who the hell are you? And Job, at the end of the book, shuts up. It's the most depressing end of the book. Go ahead, please, Shel.
Also, my comment on the story that Abraham goes to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
There's one phrase, one word at the beginning, Badonai nisa et Avraham. God tested Abraham.
Yeah.
God knew that he wasn't going to allow Abraham to carry through.
See, we can spend more time on this, you and me, because that's troubling. First of all, what do you mean tested him? What kind of test? What? First of all, they've been together now for years. Mm-hmm. Number two, how do you test a man by telling him to murder his child? What kind of test is that? Three, did God really know that he wasn't going to kill Isaac in the end? Then why take him through the I mean, that story is the most opaque story in the Bible.
Where was Isaac? He was 30 years.
Yeah, that's a whole other question about whether Isaac is complicit, which gives you the Islamic tradition where martyrdom is exalted. It's a whole. Let's not get into that. Hartman is going to say to us as follows: this argument is not new. You will find this argument in the pages of the Bible and in the pages of the Talmud. In the pages of the Bible, God intoxication is answered by an ideology that says that faith and morality must never be separated. The Sodom and Gomorrah story is that story. There's even a better story. A stranger comes to Hillel. It's Talmud Shabbos, page 33b. You all know this story. A stranger comes to Hillel and Shammai, the two great scholars of the first century, and says, teach me the Torah. I will convert to Judaism if you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. Shammai picks up a builder's rule, like a 2x4, and chases the guy away. Hillel says to him, what? Teach me the whole Torah. No, I will convert to Judaism if you teach me the whole Torah on one foot. So Hillel says, that which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That's the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Go learn it. You all know that story, right? Anybody not know that story? Now you know that story, right? A stranger comes to the two great teachers and says, I will convert if you teach me the whole Torah on one foot. One guy tells him, wait. The other guy says, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That's the whole Torah. Go learn it. What's interesting about Hillel's answer? What's in it and what's not in it? Yeah, you would expect a rabbi, if you come to a rabbi and you say, Rabbi Feinstein, I want to become a Jew, teach me the whole Torah, I have a half an hour before my next appointment. you expect me to take down a book and say, well, we believe in a God who created heaven and earth and revealed the Torah, right? If you read Maimonides, for example, the great 12th century philosopher, he writes these 13 principles of faith. Number 1 is there is a God. If you open a prayer book, what's the first thing you learned in a prayer book? Shema Yisrael Adonai. You learn about, Hear, O Israel, the Lord God, the Lord is one. God is number 1 in all of those expressions, but when a guy comes to Hillel and says, I want the whole Torah and I want it quick, what does he teach him? An ethical principle. He teaches him an ethical principle, which means that for Hillel, what is the fundamental essence of this faith? It's not belief in a God. That's in some ways secondary. Secondary. What is first? The way you behave in the world. The way you behave in the world. And you have to look at that source, and Hartman does a lovely job in this book of really taking that source apart. Number 1, he doesn't quote a verse of the Bible. He could have. There is a verse of the Bible which says something very similar. We have it on a very large window upstairs, which can be yours for a small donation. Okay? And it says, Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You will love the other as you love yourself. Right? But Hillel doesn't quote that. Why not? What does he quote? He doesn't quote anything. He gives him an ethical maxim that's not a quote from the Bible. It's an ethical maxim that all ethical people understand. Because for Hillel, ethics and faith are independent of each other. He's not dependent on his love of God or his belief in God to have an ethical point of view. Ethics is a universal possession of all human beings. And the notion of ethical reciprocity, which means don't do to your neighbor what you hate being done to you, that's ethical reciprocity, is a universal ethical maxim. Every ethical person on the planet understands that. Not everybody does it, but everybody understands it. He quotes a universal ethical principle and says, that's the whole Torah, that's the essence of the whole religion, that's the essence of all of our culture. Ethical reciprocity, natural morality. Now, all the rest is commentary. Go learn it, which means the reason you have a religion isn't to give you the fundamental ethical principle. That's given to you because you're a thinking human being. The reason you have a religion is because it's hard to live that. And you need the superstructure of a religious faith with its narratives and its rituals and its way of teaching it in order to help you live that principle. I drive the freeway every day. I think the freeway is a wonderful moral metaphor. The way people behave on the freeway tells you a lot about who they are, right? I'm trying to get on the freeway, right? Actually, over here, our entrance over here, going westward, you get on at Haskell over here, right? And you have half a mile between Haskell and Havenhurst to move over one lane, or you get stuck getting off Havenhurst. Do you know how hard it is to get California drivers to let you in? You put on your clicker, you slow down, you see a little entrance, you start moving over, and the guy doesn't want to let you in. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. You know, like, what, come on, you know, like, and then there's the guy who's on my tail, you know, an inch away from my bumper, right? And then there's the guy, I mean, you know all these people. You are all these people. I mean, one of the most instructive moral lessons I've ever had is one year I actually left, my service on Yom Kippur finished before Schulweiss's did, and I was outside in the parking lot when the service ended. For people who had just spent 25 hours repenting their sins, you people are animals trying to get out of this parking lot. All right, back to the word. All the rest is commentary. Now, the point to say is this, that there is a voice within the Jewish tradition, in the Bible and in the Talmud, which wants to say that the essence of this faith is ethics, and that anything else that supersedes it is idolatry. That's the first point. The second point, I know you asked questions, so I'll give you a second. The answer to, so that those who would say that it's either faith or ethics, either faith or morality, that's a false dichotomy. Faith and morality have to lead to the same thing. They have to lead to ethical behavior. And the other answer to this is a remarkable presentation within the Talmudic tradition. I want you to learn the phrase, because it's a very, very powerful phrase. The phrase is lifnim mishurat hadin. Lifnim mishurat hadin. So the following story, I'll explain that. The following story appears in the Talmud. Are you warm? David, you see that white knob there? Give it a half a turn to the right, because the air conditioning shuts off. That's good. Thank you. God bless you. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. If you're warm, turn on the damn air conditioning. Thank you. Early in the rabbinic tradition, there was a great leader whose name was Shimon ben Shetach. In those days, rabbis had to make a real living. Shimon ben Shetach was a textile trader. He bought and sold textiles. He worked very hard, and therefore his disciples didn't have a lot of time with him. So they conspired to get him some more leisure time so he could teach more. They decided to buy him a donkey. If he had a donkey, he could get his work done sooner, and he'd have more time in the yeshiva to teach them. So they went to a non-Jew who was selling donkeys, Ralph Williams, right, or Cal Worthington, right? And they bought him a donkey at Cal Worthington Donkeys, right? Some of you are old enough to know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, go see Cal, go see Cal, go see Cal. There you go, right. Now, the disciples, when they bring the donkey to Shimon ben Shetach, right, he jumps up on he's delighted, and he jumps up on the donkey, and oh my God, he feels something under his seat. And they reach under the saddle, and they discover a large gem, a jewel. And the disciples are overjoyed. This must be a miracle from God. It's a miracle from God. It's a sign. Now the rabbi doesn't have to work at all. This gem will support him the rest of his life, and he can live out his days teaching Torah. And Shimon ben Shetach says, "Where did you get the donkey from?" And they say, "Cal Worthington on the corner. Non-Jewish donkey. What's the law about returning lost property to non-Jews? You don't have to." And the disciples say, "But Rebbe, you don't have to return it." Shimon says, "Does he know that there was a jewel under the saddle?" And they say, "What difference does it make? What difference does it make? He's a non-Jew. You don't have to return it." And he says to his disciples, "Return the gem to the owner of the donkey." And now they're beside themselves, because for them this was a revelatory moment. This was God's miracle. And they say, "But Rebbe, you don't have to return it." And his answer is wonderful. You know what he says? "What do you think I am? A barbarian?" He said, "Ma Shimon ben Shetach, barburin?" They don't even use the word. There's no Hebrew word. It's a Greek word written in Hebrew letters. Barburin? Do you think Shimon ben Shetach is a barbarian? Now, what does that mean? What does that story mean? That is lifnim mishurat hadin. That means that for the sake of morality, you do something which the law does not require you to do. He would have been perfectly within the bounds of Jewish law, of Torah law, to not return the gem and to live out his life in leisure with the value of that gem. But he won't do that. Why not? Because his conscience, because a sense of universal morality, because a sense of moral reciprocity demands that you do the right thing. That you do the right thing. And it's interesting, the phraseology. What do you think I am, a barbarian? Meaning what? This is what any good person would do. He doesn't quote a Torah law. He quotes universal morality. Any civilized person would do this. This notion of you have to do what's right, even if it's not written in a Torah. Because that's who we are. And not only because we're Jews, it's because we're civilized human beings. Because that's what it means to be a civilized human being. to live by a code of universal ethics, no matter what your faith says, is the answer to this God intoxication business. Then there's one more level to this, which Rabbi Hartman points out, which is it's not just that he doesn't want to consider himself a barbarian. How will the world look upon him? The responsibility of a Jewish person, according to the Talmud, is to live a life of Kiddush Hashem. Now, we normally think of the phrase Kiddush Hashem to mean the sanctification of God's name as a sort of martyrdom, right? When a martyr dies, it's Almanat Kiddush Hashem, right? But the Talmud uses the phrase in a very different way. Your job is to live a life of a certain ethical quality so that people will come to understand who we are as a people and who God is as a God. God's reputation is in your hands. If a Jewish person, let's just take a theoretical idea. Suppose a Jewish bond trader or stock trader had a Ponzi scheme and defrauded hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very good people out of millions and millions of dollars and did it while he was living the life of a religious Jew. What does that do to God's reputation and to the reputation of the Jewish people in the world? This notion of Kiddush Hashem, and you should know something about Kiddush Hashem. According to the Talmud, every sin that you can imagine is atonable. Even murder. You can atone for murder. It takes a while, but it can be done. Yom Kippur comes, you really do your tshuva, you can be forgiven for every sin except one. And that's Chilul Hashem. That is defaming God in the world. According to the Talmud, that's the ultimate sin. Living in such a way as you drag down the reputation of God in the world. So the answer to this God manipulation is, you may think that your chosenness gives you some prerogative to live as a moral barbarian vis-a-vis the outsider. It's quite the opposite. You have to treat the outsider in such a manner as that outsider looks at you and says, that's a righteous person. That's a Jew. That's a follower of God. There is a stunning story in the Talmud that Hartman repeats. It's a stunning story. I should have brought you the text, but I'll just tell you the story. The stunning story goes like this. The Romans wanted to understand who these Jews were. So they sent 2 scholars to the yeshiva in Jerusalem to learn Jewish faith and culture. And these 2 scholars came and spent 2 years living among the rabbis, learning with the rabbis, and they learned the entire corpus of the Jewish tradition. They learned the entire corpus of the Jewish tradition. And then it was time for them to go back to Rome and write their report to the emperor. So they sat down and met with the rabbis who taught them. And the rabbis said, "Nu, what do you think?" And the 2 Roman inspectors said, "Well, we have to tell you something. We spent 2 years living with you, learning with you, observing you, and we're very, very, very impressed. We're impressed at the righteousness of your tradition, the moral depth of your faith, the goodness of your community. There's only one thing that bothers us a lot." And the rabbi said, "What's that?" "It's that law of not returning the property of a non-Jew. That's a flaw in your moral system." "I'll tell you what," says the 2 inspectors, "we won't tell the emperor that part." That's how the story ends. Now, who told that story? We did. That's the rabbi's self-critique of that story. So there is this voice within the tradition that says, we have to fight back against this stuff. It's too tempting to let faith become the excuse for moral laxness. It's too tempting for faith to become a divider. And the split thinking, which splits morality from faith, splits us from them, you can't let that happen. That's not who we are. That's not the best of us. And within the tradition, you hear this debate going back and forth. David, you had a question about a half an hour ago, and I successfully stifled
I
it.
think I remember.
I went to the Mussolini School of Education, so
There you go.
go ahead, please.
So the point that you were making that that the key is ethical behavior, and the Torah is there to give us a structure to behave ethically.
Right.
Then why does one need God in
That's
the
a
picture at all?
Great question. And that's what the last chapter of the book is about. I didn't set this up, I promise you. We don't know each other. We've never met, right? Pick a card, any card. Let me just say one thing before I get to that last chapter, okay? For those of you who have been around Valley Beth Shalom for a while and know what Rabbi Schulweiss's theology was, or have read his book, For Those Who Can't Believe, or have listened to him or to me, this book is, you're not going to find anything astonishing in this book. In fact, what you're going to say at the end is, gee, Schulweiss said it better. No, I'm very serious. Because what Rabbi Schulweiss's theology always was, Rabbi Schulweiss would say something of the following. He would say, look, the only thing we can say about God, and positively about God, is the morality we learn from divinity. And that divinity and morality, godliness, is godliness. For Rabbi Schulweiss, God is a verb. Right? God isn't a somebody. God isn't a thing. God isn't an entity. God is not a person. God is a verb. It's something you do. You're godding. And what's the content of godding? It's the aspirations of our ethics. It's acts which we deem godly. That is, acts that we deem so good that they fill us with a sense of divinity. Acts that are godly. So this was Schulweiss's theology from the beginning. Now, Hartman doesn't go to that place. Hartman is still an Orthodox rabbi. And he still has a sense of a God who is a real person out there in the world, but he's trying to get us to live with that God in a certain way. Schulweiss, I just want to make this distinction, and then I'll get to your question. Schulweiss went another whole step, which says there is no difference between ethics and faith, because the whole purpose of religion is to act in a godly way. Hartman wouldn't disagree with him, but Hartman still believes in a God who's out there. Schulweiss doesn't believe in a God who's out there. For Schulweiss, whatever God there is in here. That makes some sense? All right, now let's go to your question. At the end of the book, he asks 3 questions. Do you have to have God to be good? Do you have to have God to be Jewish? And do you have to have God to be a good Jew? 3 interesting questions, right? And the answers are going to surprise you. Number 1, do you have to have God to be good? Well, go back to the Hillel source, remember? Right? The stranger comes to Hillel and says, make me Jewish, I'll stand, teach me the Torah while I stand on one foot. And Hillel teaches him what? Not a verse from the Bible, not a commandment, not a dogma of belief. He teaches him a universal ethical maxim. Hartman says, ethics are independent of faith. You can be good without God. Now, there are others who disagree with this, right? Those of you who like to hear Dennis Prager, for example, on the radio, no, don't say that. Come on. It's politics we can argue with. But when Dennis's ethical position is you need God to be good because God is the insurer or the source of all that we know about goodness. Hartman argues with that. He says the very idea that Abraham can challenge God and say, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice, means that Abraham possesses a sense of right and wrong which is above his belief in God. You see? So Hartman says, no, you don't need God to be good. You need ethics to be good. Okay? Now the question you're going to ask is, what does God add? I'll get to that in a second. Number 2, do you need God to be Jewish? Well, we know lots of Jews, good Jews, I think, who don't believe in God and are not involved in religious life. And Judaism has always allowed a wide range of forms of identity. Religion is one of them, but not the only one. Plus, let's go back to the Hillel source. Man says, teach me the essence of your faith. Hillel doesn't tell him believe in God. He tells him, here's the Torah is about the ethics you believe in. So what Hartman would say, if you believe that story, is that you need ethics to be Jewish, but you don't need God to be Jewish. Do you need God to be a good Jew? This he spends more time on. Because he says, look, so much of what we consider Jewish is rooted in faith, is rooted in narratives of faith, and rooted in religion, in rituals of faith. He says, but actually the truth of the matter is, if you can be good and you can be Jewish, you can be a good Jew and not believe in God. But, he says, you can't be great. No, this is actually a very interesting argument. We can argue this one. He says, if you want to be a great Jew, you need God. Because what you need is the superstructure of faith in order to give you a sense of humility. The first thing that God gives you is a sense of humility. When you say, Baruch atah Adonai, I praise you, God, Eloheinu melech haolam, you, God, who are melech haolam, king of the universe, what you're saying is something very important. I'm not king of the universe. Right? You'd be surprised how many people, that comes as a surprise to many people. Right? No, it's very true. It's very true. You know, we're all born in a state, Freud said this, we're all born in a state of infantile egocentrism. Right? When the baby screams, mommy comes running. And the baby comes to think, I am the center of the universe. I am the center of the universe, because when I scream, mommy comes running. Right? You'd be surprised how many people grow up and never lose that. Right? I have a lot of single women friends who tell me most of the men that they date, that's exactly what they are. They still think that if they scream loud enough, some woman will come with a breast or a bottle. Right? Which is what most men want, most of all in life. This is not an unserious point. There are a lot of people who look like adults on the outside but are emotionally children on the inside who still think they are the center of the universe. To believe in God is to get rid of that idea, to realize I am part of something much bigger than myself, and that the only value of my existence is not in satisfying every one of my desires, which is the egocentric fantasy. The great egocentric fantasy, is that the whole mall belongs to me. Everything here is mine. The egocentric fantasy is that every whim of my imagination has to be fulfilled. That's the egocentric fantasy. But as you grow into maturity, you realize there's something bigger than that, which is my service to another, my relationship to another, my capacity to love, to care, to give, to build, to move outside the self. Moving outside the self yields a very different sense of myself, a very different sense of my value than fulfilling every one of my desires. To say Adonai, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam recognizes that only when I move outside myself and recognize that I'm not the center of the universe, can I truly become the person I'm meant to be. Can you be an ethical person and not believe in God? Yes, but you're not going to be a great ethical person. Because a great ethical person has to quell that egocentrism. And that's one of the things that religion does for us, says Hartman. That's one of the functions of religion. Plus, the second thing that it does for us is in some ways the exact opposite. It tells me that I have the power to make the world better. I am empowered at the same time as I am made humble. I'm also empowered. Empowered to do what? To heal the other, to help the other, to care for the other, to love the other. To love the other. Right? I would put it a slightly different way. When I talk to teenagers, I have this argument. Teenagers are all atheists. From something happens after the bar mitzvah. I don't know what it is I said on the bima or what it is we gave them as gifts, but they all turn atheists by the age of 13. And by the time they get to my class, they're all 17 when they come to my class. They're ferocious atheists. So the first thing I'll say to the kid is the following, right? You give charity? The kid says, yeah. What do you give charity to? The kid says, American Cancer Society. I said, great, wonderful charity. What do they do with the money? He says, they help doctors learn how to cure cancer. I said, good, are you sure? He says, yeah. I said, how do you know? How do you know there aren't 3 guys that take the money and go to Barbados every weekend and play the ponies? How do you know they're not wasting your money? He says, well, I did some research and I know the project. Good, that's wonderful. You want to cure cancer, right? He says, yeah. I said, how do you know it's curable? How do you know that the world is amenable to your efforts to make it better? What if I presented you with the opposite proposition? See, you think that if you contribute to the American Cancer Society, you're going to relieve the suffering of people with cancer. That's a beautiful belief. But suppose I offered you the opposite proposition. There is a constant quantity of suffering in the world. And if you relieve suffering over here, it'll only pop up over there. You defeat Al-Qaeda, you end up with ISIS. You defeat ISIS, you'll end up with something worse. You defeat smallpox, diphtheria, typhoid, and polio, you end up with AIDS. How do you know that there isn't a constant quantity of suffering in the world? Because if you believe there was a constant quantity of suffering in the world, you wouldn't bother giving to charity because you're not really going to help anything, right? You take the money and go to Vegas, or you give it to the rabbi to go to Vegas, or the rabbi would go to Vegas, right? Come on. How do you know that the world is amenable, that the world accepts your efforts to make it better and actually improves? And the answer is you don't. There is no empirical evidence for that. You can make a very strong empirical case for that other proposition. Your belief that the world can be fixed is a statement of faith. It's a statement of faith by anybody who ever gives $1 to charity. It's a statement of faith by anyone who ever brought a child into the world. Because if you really believe that the world was miserable and couldn't be made better, bringing a child into that world is a terrible act of sadism. You brought a child in the world because you truly believe that tomorrow can be better than yesterday. How do you know that tomorrow can be better than yesterday? That's a statement of faith, right? Now, I do this on a 17-year-old, and I get this look on their face like, oh. I said, okay, so now I believe that the world can be made better. I can't prove it, but I believe in it, right? That's the beginning of a belief. I'm going to suggest that that's another. Hartman doesn't get into this. Hartman gets into some other stuff, but that's the empowerment notion. That monotheism empowers you to make certain acts in the world to make the world better. Humility and empowerment are the two things that he argues are the result of a belief in God that makes you not a good Jew, but a great Jew. And that's where he says you need God. It's a very weak argument for an Orthodox rabbi, I have to tell you. And you wait till the end of the book because you know that he's going to get to it. And you're waiting by the end of the book, and you've read now 175 pages. You say, oh, now he's going to get to the argument. And when he gets to it, you say, I think he could have done a better job on that chapter. The rest of the book, I think, is quite remarkable, though. All right, there was some other chapter. Yes, please, Evelyn. See, that's a wonderful question. What's the difference between Jewish ethics and Christian ethics? Okay? Let me say it in two different ways. Number one, in their pure form, none. All ethics are universal. Right? What we do is we express those ethics in the languages of the families and communities and faiths that we're comfortable with. So that what the difference between Jewish ethics and Christian ethics are not the fundamental principles of those ethics, but the way that we express them. If I say to you, do an act of tzedakah, and go visit Mesh in the hospital, right? Because it's Bikur Cholim. There's no English words in that phrase, right? Right. If I say to you, do an act of tzedakah, right? You understand what I'm talking about. Because we were trained since we were little kids to understand what tzedakah is, right? Do an act of chesed, right? Taka, it's a mitzvah, right? A Christian doesn't talk that way. I don't know if you knew that, but Christian doesn't talk that way. A Christian would say something different. Talk about Christian charity, the heart of Christian charity. Now, you and I don't speak the words, do the heart. What would Jesus do? Like these wonderful little kids walking around, what would Jesus do on their bracelets, right? That's not our language. Our language is do an act of tzedakah, right? That's one answer to your question. Here's the second answer. While ethical principles might in fact be universal, in their application to real-life situations, we have variations. Okay, so an ethical principle is do unto others as you want them to do to you. What's hateful to you, do not do to the other. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's called ethical reciprocity. Okay? That's ethical reciprocity. Okay? There's a fellow on the street who asks me for $1. A fellow on the off-ramp who asks me for $1. Should I give him $1? Well, part of my problem there is the facts of the situation. Does he really need the dollar? Is he a person who's simply taking advantage of my good-heartedness? There's worse problem here. What if he's a drug addict? And I give him $1 and he buys heroin with the $1. I'm contributing to his own self-destruction. I don't want to give him So now we get into the application of universal ethical principles, and that varies. There are Christian applications which are different than Jewish applications. We have different ways of constructing our ethical situations. You see how that works? And so you could have arguments between Jewish ethics and Christian ethics. But at their principled level, they're fundamentally the same. Right? So then you'd ask me the following question. What about Muslim ethics? Because right now the Muslim community is under terrible attack, because we see so many acts of violence performed in the act of Islam, right? So the question is, why has the Muslim community not taught these ethics to their kids? And that's a serious question. And here you'd have to say this issue of God intoxication and God manipulation is very virulent in certain segments, not all, in certain segments of the Muslim community. There are Muslim teachers who are very aware of this and working very hard to fix this. And some of them are wonderful, wonderful tzaddikim. They're wonderful, righteous people working very hard to do this. But the Muslim community is in crisis right now because of these very issues. So are there Muslim ethics? Absolutely. But sometimes they get eclipsed by these terrible problems of God intoxication and God manipulation. Does that make some sense? Great. Someone else had a question. Yes, please. Please. Yeah. Yeah. That's a wonderful thing to see, because it's brave, and also because you want to see very public voices in that tradition's community speaking for a certain kind of universal morality. And there are such voices, and they do speak for that morality. Unfortunately, they're drowned out by the more radical elements. And that's something that we have to, that we hope for. That's something that the whole world is struggling with right now. Right? Someone else had a question? Yes, please. Hi.
Everyone says the chosen people, but you told the story that we chose.
Yeah.
So that's been sort of sitting with me this whole time.
That we chose.
That we chose to be righteous people.
The Talmud's idea is that God offered the Torah to all the people in the world, and we're the only ones who wanted it, and therefore we're not obligated to consider the others, right? But then the other voice in the tradition is, and then there's other ideas that we're chosen. But the other option is, but that's not the way that you show people that you're chosen. You show people that you're chosen by acting in an exemplary way, not in a selfish way. So, well, right. Well, Shimon ben Shetak says, what do you think? I'm a barbarian? I mean, that's such a great line, right? Because what he said, like, what do you expect of me? I'm going to use my religious faith to justify an act of selfishness, of callousness? And you think that's good for us in the world? You think that's good for God in the world? You think that's what God wants in the world? You see? You think that's what God wants in the world? You see? Now, I would ask the next question, because I know you're going to accuse me of being political, so go ahead and do that. I think America has to ask the same question. We have been chosen, America. I believe that. We have more riches than any country in the world by far. How do you behave? And America has always had an aspiration to behave in a certain fashion. Right? And the question is, how do we behave? How does a chosen nation behave, right? I believe in American exceptionalism. I really do. America has to be exceptionally just, exceptionally righteous in the way that it conducts itself in the world, because that's American exceptionalism, right? So I'm going to vote for a candidate who believes that. If you can find one on the ballot, would somebody tell me who the hell it is? Yes, please.
Rabbi Schulweis was a Reconstructionist. How would you give this talk to a Reconstructionist congregation?
I would give the same talk. I thought it was a very nice talk, and I'm really glad that you came. No, you really don't want to do that. No, look, here's what Schulweis did. Here's what Schulweis did, which I think is a very interesting. Rabbi Schulweis said the following. Rabbi Hartman believes in a God who is a great, he believes in a God who's out there. And he wants to have a relationship with that God who's out there, but he wants to control his own morality. Rabbi Schulweis did not believe in a God who's out there for a very, very simple reason. Because if you posit a God who's out there, who is all-powerful, right, and all good, which is how that God is often described, then you have to account for the evil of the world that you live in. You have to account for tsunamis and cancer and holocausts and all the rest. And Rabbi Schulweis said, you can't. There's no way to live with a God out there and acknowledge the evil that's right in front of us. So Rabbi Schulweis said, I choose not to believe in a God out there. What God I find in the world, I find within the capacity of human beings to heal and to help. It's human beings' actions to do the godly thing. Now, what's the godly thing? It's what my tradition has discovered over the 3,000 years of its history makes the world worth living in. Other traditions have found other things which they deem godly, and we can have that conversation with each other. So in many ways, Rabbi Schulweis is more radical than Rabbi Hartman. They would certainly agree that ethics must never be separated from faith. They would certainly agree that one must never use faith to divide people. They must certainly agree that faith has to be carefully policed so that it doesn't become an excuse for moral callousness, for moral uncaring. They would agree on that. They would disagree when you talk about who is this God you worship. For Rabbi Hartman, God is really an other. He talks about God as the other, as the absolute other. Rabbi Schulweis would say, I don't believe in that God, because I don't believe in a God and that would tolerate the evil that I see in the world. What I do believe is in the moral capacity of human beings to do godly acts. So for Schulweis, God is not a somebody. God is what we do when we contribute to a godly world. It's a verb. It's an adverb. It's a process, if you will. You see? And that's where Schulweis would come out even more radical than Hartman, which is why I've been watching. If you go online, you can meet Rabbi Hartman. If you just Google the name of this book, D-O-N-N-I-E-L, Daniel Hartman, H-A-R-T-M-A-N, and you'll find a bunch of interviews with him. He's done this, he's talked about this book in a number of different places, and he's been interviewed in a number of places. And it's really interesting to watch the response of the audience, because a lot of these audiences have never heard these ideas before, right? And here at VBS, because we've been talking about this stuff for 40 years, it's not radical at all. In fact, in some ways, it's more conservative than what Rabbi Schulweis taught us, right? Now, Schulweis was, I'll give you one more little story about Schulweis, because I'm spending a lot of time with him these days. So I'm writing his biography. So Schulweis would tell you that, that he doesn't believe in a God out there. He doesn't believe in a personal God. God is godly. God is in here. Yes, except when he davens. And then he davens like his grandfather. And I asked him once, I said, I watch you pray. You certainly seem like you're talking to somebody. You lose all of your theological radicalness when you're davening, right? Now, he would say, no. He would never accept that. But I know better. You see, I think that human beings, there is a mode of human being, and I'll tell you what it's called. It's called play, P-L-A-Y. Play is when I suspend a great deal of my rationality, and I enter a world that I construct, right? I can go to a play at the Music Center, and for a few minutes, I'm in 13th century Verona with two teenagers madly in love, a Romeo and a Juliet. And at the end of that presentation, I'm weeping like a baby, right? Do I know that I'm at the Music Center in LA and those are just actors? Of course I do. But I put that aside and I enter the drama. That's called play, right? I can go to now I can go to the Coliseum. And I can see very, very large athletic men beat the stuffing out of each other. And I can root for us against them. Do I know that these are all free agents who couldn't care less whether they're playing for St. Louis or LA or God knows where? Yes, of course. But for a few minutes, it's called play. Prayer can also be a form of play, where I suspend my rational judgment, and for a few minutes I can live with my grandfather's God. And I can enjoy that. And then I can stop and I can come back. And I think that's what he was doing. That's what I'm writing in my paper. He would disagree with that, because he was so ferociously cerebral. But I know better. So, and I love him enough. Evie, yeah. Right. I think Rabbi Hartman would say the following. This idea of God intoxication and God manipulation doesn't only apply to religion. It applies to any totalitarian philosophy, any way of thinking about the world in which we invest something in the world with the quality of absolute. An absolute. What is an absolute? It means I don't question it. For a religious person, that's God. But for a German of 1930s Germany, that became the Führer, right? And the Führer was so good at manipulating people, you know, those giant rallies and all that stuff, so that he became, as it were, God for the German people. So that when he says to them, I want you to sacrifice your morality for the sake of the fatherland, that's a form of God manipulation. And I want you to put aside your morality because your love of the fatherland is more important than your love of humanity. That's God intoxication. It's the same phenomenon. It's the same phenomenon, right? You know? So these people who get young kid, this bombing in Turkey was a child. He was 13 years old. To get a 13-year-old to strap a bomb to his body and then blow himself up. And the person and Himmler, who got these people to work in concentration camps and do despicable things. They weren't all sadists. I mean, certainly a lot of them were, of course, but the Germans weren't all sadists. Some of them were actually very nice people, but they believed with all their hearts that they were doing something good for the fatherland and the world by destroying the Jewish people, right? It's a form of God intoxication and God manipulation. So what Hartman has to say is that you need an independent moral voice to say to you, wait a minute, that's not ethical. You know that's not ethical, right? You need the Sodom and Gomorrah voice to stop you from performing an Al-Qaeda thing, right? Which is the eclipse of morality. And that's how you would understand it. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, no. We're going to wrap up in a minute because I want to get some ice cream. So go ahead.
All right. You've brought up this issue of chosenness.
Yogurtland, or Menchie's.
Of chosenness a lot.
Menchie's would be the right place to go after a lecture like this, don't you think? Yeah.
But in working as a lifeguard at Rabbia this past summer, I came up with the question, if I was working at a pool where Jews, non-Jews, all people came, and I see two people at the bottom of the pool, one could be a Jew, one could be a non-Jew, would I be obligated to save both of them, or try to, or
Yes.
should I try to save the Jew first, then the non-Jew?
Right. So if you were to say to that guy, you're obligated to save the Jew first and not the non-Jew, I think that's a form of manipulation. If you say to them, you got to save both of them. So make the best judgment you can under the circumstances about who you want to save, right? That's a species of universal conscience, right? That's a species of conscience. If you're really a good lifeguard, though, you shouldn't have two people at the bottom of your pool. So it turns out that not only are you ethically deficient, you're professionally deficient. And you're going to get fired, you know, that's what's going to happen. Dave, you get the last question, we're going to call it a night.
What I was taught, what you're talking about, the play,
Yeah,
it was called the willing suspension of disbelief.
yeah, the willing suspension of disbelief.
And it seems to me that some of what you're saying, I think of my father, I think of all the Jews that don't believe in Judaism but are fiercely Jewish. And it's ethical. It has to do with ethics and values and tikkun olam and all of those kinds of things.
Right.
But I think of that need, if one wants to admit it, that need to suspend disbelief.
Yeah, I think,
Which is what you're talking about, it seemed to me. And
Well, you're talking about prayer,
I
but-
felt I saw that with Rabbi Schulweis.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot.
Frequently, right. There's a beautiful story in the tradition about a guy prays to God. He wants to see the most righteous man in the town. And God tells him he's the one who crawls on all fours and barks like a dog. He says, what? God says, go look for him. And he spends, he looks and looks and looks and looks, and then one day he's sitting in the marketplace, and he sees a guy playing with his grandchildren. And the man gets down on all fours and starts pretending he's a dog, and the baby starts petting him and feeding him stuff, and the man comes to understand what it is, right? Because you have the capacity, we human beings have a large repertoire of behaviors. And one can be fully ethically consistent, intellectually consistent, and still have a large dose of play inside of him. I think we can. And I think that's one of the elements of religion. I really, I'm Rabbi Schulweis's student, so I believe very strongly in a religion that I can believe in ethically and believe in intellectually. But I also understand, and he and I had a big argument about this, I also understand the human need for myth and magic and play. Not that I take that seriously too much, because I know that I'm not in Verona, and I know that those two actors on the stage didn't really kill each other, right? But I can enter into that drama because it speaks to something inside of me. And sometimes I think that religion has the same quality. I can enter into the drama of my religion and have the same quality, the same quality of play, and enjoy it for a few minutes because it speaks to something within me, okay? Let's just finish really quickly. First of all, thank you for coming. It's great to see you all again. Next week, no. Next week, come back next week, same time. Just this Thursday. After that, I don't know what's going to happen. But come next Thursday, 7 o'clock, and we're going to take a quick tour of the art and look at that. And then the cantor has some beautiful new music to share with us. And then we're going to talk about this idea of ayeka, the self-examination. I used to call it as the Jew turns. I think it's very clever. The self-examination that is demanded of us this time of year, and what it means to do a process of self-examination and self-reflection and self-improvement as we begin these high holidays. We're going to talk about that using some of the texts of the Machzor and some of the texts of the tradition. The book is called Putting God Second. It's a very, very good book. If nothing else, he brings wonderful sources, and he reads them with wonderful depth, and I think it's really worthwhile read. And I really appreciate everybody coming tonight. Take good care.